There we go. All right, so we're going to start with period one. We're going to continue with the wars of religion. When we talk about the wars of religion, we know those are remnants of the Reformation, disagreements between Catholics and various Protestant groups, Calvinists, Lutherans, Anabaptists, etc., over their religious beliefs. Also, as you know, there's definitely a secular component to this. In the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire, aka Germany and surrounding friends, many of our princes, dukes, whatever, will commit to Lutheranism not out of a genuine religious desire, but because it keeps them away from having papal control, and there's not an organization to pay taxes to. So therefore, it gives them more money and more autonomy. So they certainly take advantage of that. We look at France. France, as we know, has got a young royal couple. They have 6 children. So the thought is very promising for their continued domination for many decades, perhaps even centuries. Of course, that's not how it works out. There are 4 sons. 3 of them die pretty young. One before he even becomes the king himself. We have a daughter who dies childless, and then our final daughter is going to get married to a Protestant. So we'll come back to that in a little bit. But the whole sordid affair starts with a jousting accident. If I had a nickel for every time I told that story, I'd be a wealthy man. And so the king is going to be killed with a lance in the face, and then control passes on to his 6 sets of children, none of whom have any surviving children. So that's going to be a big problem. The key player in this time period is a woman named Catherine de' Medici. She is the widow. According to French law, she cannot be queen with autonomy and the ability to make laws, but she is the chief advisor and regent for her sons for multiple decades. When they become of age, she is oftentimes the most prominent person in their ear, advising their policies. So Catherine's got a difficult situation. She, of course, her family, the Valois, are Catholic. There is also another family, the Guise, that are also Catholic. And so they would love nothing more than to overtake the throne and become the monarchs of France themselves. And then, of course, even though about less than 10% of French people are Huguenots or French Calvinists, the nobility is about 50%. So therefore, she has to balance the needs of those people. As you probably remember, at this time, we don't collect income tax by governments. So therefore, many of your nobles are going to be wealthier than your governments. Pretty much the way taxes were collected was either on excise, so as you trade goods around, or on consumption taxes. There's no sales tax, so the governments just don't have as much in their pockets. So we're afraid that if we make certain noble groups angry, they'll rise up and could very easily overthrow us, especially at a time we've got a bunch of kids without a king of age. That's a very dangerous time. So she tries to keep the other Catholics happy. She tries to keep the Protestants happy. She's constantly balancing back and forth on who gets advice. And she was really running the country for about 20 years and does a pretty darn good job of it. Of course, she is from that Medici family, so her skill and training should not be doubted. She comes from good stock, if you will, and had some training as a young woman on how to operate in those situations. Now, the other key figure is a guy who's going to eventually be called Henry IV. Henri, each at one point, all of the 3 families are headed by a man named Henry, which is rather unfortunate for historians. But the situation is that the Guises, the other Catholic family, just decides to start attacking Protestants. They just take it in their own hands. They're vigilantes, basically. And Catherine has to be careful that she doesn't make them too angry, that she doesn't engage in war, because that's not a good idea at this point for her family and their pocketbooks. So she basically lets them get away with it while seething and being frustrated that they're being so aggressive. And so eventually what's going to happen is open warfare does in fact break out. It's called the War of the Three Henrys. If you don't know that detail, it doesn't matter. That is one of the bullets in your study guide, but it is part of that conflict. And so this starts in the 1570s and will last for about 2 decades. And so at one point, what Catherine does to try to stop this conflict is infamously marry her youngest daughter, Margot or Marguerite, to Henry. This is purely a political match. They don't like each other. In fact, at that time, Margot, her daughter, is seeing and having a romantic relationship with Henry Guise. But of course, at that point, royal relationships don't mean you have to stop your other romantic relationships, because they're just about convenience anyway. They're about producing children and having matches, what you do in your private life, and whatever. If you're rich, you get away with everything. That's certainly changed in modern times. Oh, wait, that's still true. So what that means is we eventually have conflict. And probably the most capable of all of Catherine's children, Henry III, is killed in battle. And so when he dies, there is no other successor except for the brother-in-law, because he's also related as a cousin, because French law prohibits women taking the throne. So Henry will become king. Now, he is a Huguenot, a Protestant. At that time, the law was a Protestant could not even set foot in the city of Paris in 1589. So he is going to famously get the designation of a politique. A politique is defined as someone who puts the political needs of their citizens and their country over their own personal religious desires, which obviously in a time period that is named the Age of Religious Wars is pretty unusual. So he says, I will convert to Catholicism. His famous quote is, Paris is worth a mass, not the unit of the metric system, which doesn't exist in 1589, but rather the Catholic mass, where he will go and go through the motions of being a Catholic. He will, several years later, 1598, pass the Edict of Nantes. The Edict of Nantes allows French Calvinists, also known as Huguenots, to legally practice their faith in the open. They no longer have to be secretive. They no longer have to have underground churches in people's homes. They can actually build churches, put Huguenot on the outside, and be loud and proud about their beliefs. And this will be the law in France for 85 years until Henry's grandson, a man you may remember, Louis XIV, comes along and removes it with the Edict of Fontainebleau, and then all sorts of other calamities occur, which you may remember from our trials in the fall, and we'll get into next week. So the French Wars of Religion are actual civil wars that raged for almost 2.5 decades. Lots of people die. There's the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre at the wedding, which we saw of Henry and Margot, which we saw a clip about in class from a French film called Queen Margot. And so a lot of people die. It's calamitous. The Valois family, which again, if you'd said in 1560, are they going to be around for a while? Of course, they have a young married couple and they have 6 children already. Surely we'll have some heirs. And oddly enough, none of that ends up happening. So it's pretty remarkable in a twist and turn. So Henry is going to be the first member of the Bourbon family because that is his family name. He is also sometimes called Henri de Navarre. Navarre is the province where he is from, which today is actually part of Spain. But Henri de Bourbon, and that will be the Bourbon dynasty as we know it in America. And of course, their family symbol is the fleur-de-lis, which is why that is the symbol of cities like New Orleans and Louisville, because of course we are ourselves named after one of the Bourbon monarchs of France, Louis XVI. So that is the French Wars of Religion in very simplified form. We skipped a lot of stuff, but again, big picture is all you really need to know. So we do have a tentative agreement, which will last for 3/4 of a century approximately, where French Calvinists can openly worship their faith without discrimination. All right, we then move on to Spain. Spain's conflict is going to be with one of their colonies, because of course Spain is so Catholic, there's no Reformation. There's not even a hint of the Reformation in the early 16th century, because Spain under Ferdinand and Isabella had enacted the Reconquista, where they finished conquering the Moors, the Muslims who had been in Spain for 700 years, and then they undertake the Inquisition, where they attack Jews and Muslims who had previously been welcomed in that culture and basically torture them to reveal who their friends are who have the same religion, and many either leave if they can or are killed or are forced to convert. So it's a pretty rough time. So just 25 years later, there's going to be no Reformation because there's nobody willing to challenge the authority of the Spanish monarchs. So one of their grandchildren, a guy named Philip II, again, a son of Charles V of Martin Luther's trial, of the ruler of the Netherlands, of the guy who is under control when much of the Spanish Empire is created with Cortez and Pizarro. That guy was a good ruler and fairly well known for being solid at his job. He decides when he dies, or when he retires, he dies a couple years later, to split up his empire. And we get the Austrian Habsburgs, which we will talk about later on, and then we get the Spanish Habsburgs. So we divide up that empire. Philip II will be the monarch, and Philip will rule for over 40 years. Philip will eventually marry Bloody Mary of England. When she dies, he tries to marry Elizabeth I of England. That doesn't go well. She says no. So he is involved in a lot of this as well. Now, Philip is hardcore Catholic, no other possibility of faith for his people. And if he had just allowed his Dutch colonies to continue to make him money left and right, that would have been just fine. But he decides that the Dutch, who had largely become Calvinist in the Reformation, must also become Catholic. And that is a deal breaker for him. We got to have Catholicism. Now, if you know anything about the Netherlands, you know that throughout their history, they have always been a pretty liberal, open, tolerant place. Things like prostitution being legal, marijuana being legal far before it was in much of the rest of the world, needle exchange programs for heroin addicts, because you're not going to get mad at people and make them stop doing drugs because they're addicts. That kind of behavior is something that the rest of the world for years was like, whoa. And then many other countries or states are starting to look at some of those same policies. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's had a, generally I would say Dutch people say it has had a positive effect on their society. And this was their character also 400 years ago. So when Philip II comes in and says, y'all gonna be Catholic. Excuse me? No, you can't make us do this. Now, what is the major contribution the Dutch have in this time in the world? What do they produce? What do they do?
Aren't they like shippers? The
They are,
merchants,
as I like
maybe?
to tell you, they're the UPS of Europe. So they are the ones who take that silver that the Spanish have mined that has been brought over on galleons to Europe, and they will send it to Asia. As you may know, China demands European silver because the Chinese believe European trade goods are crap and they have no desire for them. And so a lot of that shipping is done by the Dutch. We will eventually, in this time period, create the Dutch East India Company, the richest company that has ever existed in the history of our planet. It dwarfs modern mega companies like Ford or Exxon, or any of those companies have nowhere near the volume of trade that the Dutch East India Company did back in the 17th and early 18th centuries. They will also establish some colonies over in that part of the world, namely Indonesia, which will be their colony until the 1950s. So the Dutch are like, no, we're not going to be Catholic. And Philip II is like, yeah, you are. And he sends in this guy called the Duke of Alba, and the Duke of Alba is like his number one goon. He's going to go in and crack some skulls. He's going to intimidate, threaten, jail, and frankly, murder people. His time in the Netherlands is called the Reign of Blood, or the Council of Blood. So he is going in there to kill folks and try to terrorize them into converting to Catholicism. Now, at this point, what we called back then Flanders, today Belgium, is part of the Netherlands. They are not separate states. And they don't get along very well. Again, the Dutch have a different language, have a different religion primarily. Most of our Flemish people, today Belgians, are Catholic and speak French. They don't like each other very much, but they kind of have they get along fine. Like a roommate your freshman year of college, you don't really have much choice. Your sophomore year, you can pick a different roommate if you want, but your first year, you're kind of stuck with whoever they put you with. So, but you get along. You don't want to murder each other, but you don't really get along either. Well, what changes is when the Spanish come in and try to be threatening, the Flemish people get upset. How dare you come in and try to tell us what to do? So our Catholic Belgians join in with the Dutch in revolting against Spanish control. It's not about religion. It's about foreigners coming in and trying to get up in our business, which is something they will not tolerate or support. So we have a civil war. It is going to last for 80 years, sometimes called the 80 Years' War. We officially don't become independent until the Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, the end marker of our time period. But basically, we're pretty much unofficially independent by the beginning of the 17th century. And so we're going to have a lot of fighting. It cost a lot of money. So when we look back at this time period, one of our great questions is, why isn't Spain one of the wealthiest, most dominant countries in the world? They were the first up on the exploration game. They have massive colonies that are producing great wealth for them. A lot of that wealth is going to be wasted in this conflict. Also, Philip likes to build lots of palaces. He deigns himself very similar to later on what we think of Louis XIV. And so he builds a lot of these palaces, and they cost a lot of money, and they don't really have benefit for the Spanish people. So Philip II pretty much blows all of that money that's coming in from the colonies, so much so when his son Philip III takes over in 1598, he's like, where's the money? And they're like, your dad spent it. Whoops. So that's very costly in many, many ways. Now, the last thing we'll mention about the Spanish wars of religion, this also ties into England, is that, again, his wife, Mary I, Bloody Mary, who only rules for 5 years in England at that time, she dies of some form of cancer, probably ovarian, and is not able to have a child. So the throne, of course, goes to her half-sister Elizabeth, and who is unmarried. And therefore, Philip's like, ooh, I'm going to have this action as well. He pursues Elizabeth, and she flat out says, no, not interested, no thank you. And Philip can't believe this. Who tells him no? Now, so he will hold on for multiple decades for a chance to get back at Elizabeth, and he will finally have the chance And we'll talk about that very briefly in a moment. In 1588, he unleashes what is called the Spanish Armada, their great fleet of naval ships. He's going to invade England. He's going to take it over. He's going to turn it into Spangland. And of course, that doesn't happen. The English ships are smaller, faster, more maneuverable, and the weather sucks in the English Channel, which it often does, and that allows the English to win a great victory and begin their ascendancy to global domination. And I would argue that loss helps propel the Spanish even further downward. Also, the fact their king blew all their money. So, kind of like an addict. You're like, what'd you do with all your money? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, you did. You put it in your arm or in your liver or wherever. So that's what we see. Does that broadly sort of kind of make sense? Everybody good with that? All right, and then the last one is going to be the English Civil War. Of course, this is the fun one. We know Henry VIII has many infamous exploits. He has 6 wives in an attempt to have a male heir. His third wife, the one supposedly he loves the most, Jane Seymour, gives him a child named Edward. Of course, unfortunately, Jane dies in childbirth. And so Edward's the youngest of the kids, but Henry will disown his daughters, marry twice, in fact, to allow Edward to take the throne first. He is committed to keeping his father's religion, the Church of England, which is still kind of sort of wobbly at this point. How is it different than Catholicism outside of the fact that it's English? And the answer is not a whole lot. Edward will commission the writing of what's called the Book of Common Prayer, something that will pop up throughout English history in the next 200 years or so as very important. It basically says, here's what Anglican services look like. Here's what prayers you should have. Here's what songs you should sing. In other words, it's strict government control of religion. In the 17th century, this will cause a war with the Scots because he is going to try to enforce the Scottish, who are Presbyterians, an offshoot of Calvinism, to follow Church of England rules. And that's not something they're going to want to do. And we literally go to war over a prayer book, but we'll come back to that in a few minutes. So anyway, what is going to occur is Edward gets sick and dies at 16. He tries to appoint his distant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, who's 16 years old and didn't know this was coming, as the queen, because she's also a Protestant. She is going to be executed for this attempt after 9 days on the throne. And then the throne passes to Mary, the oldest daughter of Henry VIII, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, who of course is a staunch Catholic herself. So Mary is also a hardcore Catholic on her own. She earns the nickname Bloody Mary for executing over 250 nonconformists over the next 5 years. So just to be clear, Mary becomes queen in 1553. You don't need to memorize these dates. We have been a Church of England state at that point for 20 years. Her dad marries Anne Boleyn in 1533. The Parliament of England passes the Act of Supremacy 1534, so which officially codifies the Church of England. So that's been around for 2 decades. So a lot of us are like, yay, Protestantism. And now Mary's like, no, Catholicism. So some people stand up to her and she executes them, which is why she gets the name Bloody Mary. Many of them, of course, are also nobles and people of high social level. So that's frightening to them. We're not killing random people. We don't really care what they think. If we, intimidate the top, it'll filter through the rest of society. When she dies without a child, the throne goes to her half-sister and the last remaining child of Henry, and that is Elizabeth I. Elizabeth will rule for 45 years, inspire numerous portrayals in pop culture and literature. Shakespeare is a big fan because she is a big fan of him, and will be renowned as a pretty good ruler. She also gets the name of a politique for being relatively tolerant for her day. Now, again, let's be careful if we have to write about this and not say like, she's very tolerant. No, she's tolerant for a time period. You still got fined if you missed church 2 Sundays in a row. Like they took attendance and you got a fine. So let's not say like, oh, it's tolerant. Tolerant for the 16th century. Now, the English, of course, have a law allowing women to be the king, the ruler, the queen. Does that mean she is instantly respected because of her gender? Of course not. That's ridiculous. So there's a lot of doubts. She is thought she needs to get married as soon as possible, have offspring. That is a queen's primary role in almost every European society that's a monarchy. Got to have those babies. That's what we need. And she, a little bit here and there. The rumor is she has a lover who is not of an appropriate social status to marry. There's a lot of rumors. We'll never know the truth on that, I'm sure, unless there's some secret letter, in a secret compartment somewhere that comes out. But for the most part, probably true, but we'll never know. And she just decides not to get married. So, she just does not want that to happen. So once she enters into her 40s and it becomes obvious she probably will not bear children, the shift becomes to be who will be her successor. And this is going to be played out in the royal lineage of her family. Her father's sister has children, and through that we have a woman named Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary, Queen of Scots had been originally betrothed to the oldest son of Henry II of France, he of the joust in the face, and Catherine de' Medici. She actually is raised in France from about the time she's about 8 years old. And then whenever Henry dies and then the oldest son dies, she's basically said, like, we don't need you, and they ship her back to Scotland. It's almost like they treat women like objects instead of actual people. Who knew? So she goes back home and is immediately not liked by her own people because she was raised a Catholic, because she's raised in France. And so Scotland, again, primarily Presbyterian. Presbyterians being an offshoot of Calvinists. This is not that like diet Catholicism of the Church of England. This is hardcore Catholics suck. We hate them. Everything about them is wrong. The Pope's terrible. So this is not well received. But she is the rightful heir to the throne, and she will take that throne. She suffers some pretty terrible things at the hands of men, rapes probably, sexual assaults and other things, forced marriages, all sorts of terrible things. She is forced to marry a pretty terrible guy named Lord Darnley. They have a son. That son will later on become James I of England and James VI of Scotland. She has another man involved, not necessarily of her own choosing, probably. That man decides to blow up her house with her husband in it. It is thought, well, he probably dies in the fire, but his body's discovered mostly not burned, and his neck is broken. So fires don't break your neck. So therefore, it is assumed that this man killed this other man, romantic rivalry, and Mary probably had something to do with it. Again, there's really no evidence of that, but it's just the assumption. She's a woman, so of course she had something to do with it. And so she is forced to flee. She is run out of Scotland as fast as possible. She has to leave her son behind, and she seeks refuge in England. Her cousin, Elizabeth, who she's never met, allows this to happen. But once Elizabeth, about a couple years later, enters her 40s and is unlikely to have children, this means that Mary, Queen of Scots, is now the next in line to the throne because she's a cousin and the oldest cousin. So this means that if Elizabeth were to pass away while Mary, Queen of Scots, is alive, she becomes the next Queen of England, a Catholic. Mary could get married again. She could have another child. She could raise that child as a Catholic, and much like Henry VIII did, put her younger child above the line of succession of her older child, who, being left behind in Scotland, is raised Presbyterian. So he's a Protestant. So basically, you got two warring factions. If Elizabeth were to die either of natural causes or to be helped into the afterlife while Mary's alive, Catholic queen. If we can kill Mary before we kill Elizabeth, then it's the son who will be a Protestant. So we have basically lots of spying, all that stuff going on. We talked about the details of this. You don't really need to remember all of them. But long story short, basically people sneak messages into Mary, Queen of Scots under her house arrest. She thinks she is writing secret responses to them. Of course, everything she writes is being read by government officials. And there is one guy who says, "Your Majesty, it'd be great if Queen Elizabeth were to die and you could become our queen. You'd be the best one," all that good stuff. And basically Mary said, "Sure, that'd be great." That's all she says. Well, it turns out that means she supports the killing of the queen, and she is guilty of treason and must die. Pretty flimsy, but yeah. Elizabeth is anxious over this. Oh my gosh, what do I do? She finally agrees to sign the death warrant for her cousin, and in 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, is executed. This now means that whenever Elizabeth does, as Shakespeare says, shuffle off this mortal coil, her cousin, second cousin now, James VI of Scotland, will become James I of England as well. One of the first steps in uniting those nations into eventually what we will call Great Britain. So Elizabeth will go on for the next several years. Philip II uses the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots as his excuse to invade, because he says she's a Catholic, first of all, and I must defend Catholicism. And even though maybe Mary had done some shady things, you just don't kill other monarchs. It's not socially acceptable. So he's defending monarchs everywhere, wink, wink. This is just his excuse to invade. Of course, the Spanish take the L. Elizabeth wins, and she goes down as one of the great monarchs in European history, especially in England. So that's 1603 when she passes. So the wars of religion at this point are over, at least in those three big countries. We'll come back in a second to the German states. But let's update a few other things as we get close to 1648. We'll stay in England for the time being because that's where we are. We then get the Tudor family is over. We now have the Stuarts. The Stuarts, of course, come from Scotland, James and Charles. The one thing you should really remember, James had already been king in Scotland for a decade or so. The Scottish have a parliament, but it's air quotes parliament. They don't really challenge what he says. They do what he wants. He gets what he wants from them. Versus he comes to England. England has a parliament that was established in 1215, the Magna Carta. And all authority over finances, taxation, is under their control and has been for 400 years. So while they don't control the military or the laws that are passed, if you want money and you need more of it, you got to go through Parliament if you're the English monarch. And that means you have to listen to these people to some extent. And they are not random people. They're nobles. They're rich. They're powerful. They're all scheming to take your job and to get more influence in society. So James has a really hard time in England because Parliament pushes back. They question him. They want him to listen to them. And he doesn't get it. Now, James is relatively savvy, and for the most part, he makes nice. He famously pacifies the Puritans who want a new translation of the Bible. Why is our English version of the Bible translated from the Latin Catholic version? We should go all the way back to original documents and get a new translation into English from those original Hebrew, etc. documents. And this happens, called the King James Bible, probably the most famous book ever written down in the English language, 1611. But many of them are not happy. And so several years later in 1620, as you may know, a group of them will set out to the American colonies and form a colony at Plymouth. And those people are Puritans from England at that time. All right. However, it's really James's son, Charles, who is just going to have a hard time with that parliament. He doesn't get why they should even have a say. He's a divine right monarch. What is this foolishness? And so he famously just does not deal with parliament for a while. When they ask for him to sign what's called the Petition of Right, that he will give them certain privileges, he refuses. But then he tries to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Scots, which they're like, no, that's Church of England. We're Presbyterian. We're not doing that. And they actually start to invade Britain and get within about 150 miles of London, at which point he is forced to sign the Petition of Right, granting Parliament all these rights. They pass new taxes to fund an army, which then goes up and defeats the Scots. Whew. Crisis over. Old Charlie takes that document, rips it up, and says, kidding, not really meaning it, which really angers the Parliament. You had said we'd have these rights, and now you say we don't. So what happens is Charlie doesn't call the Parliament for the next decade. He just doesn't call them in, because one of the parts of the Magna Carta is Parliament only meets under the king's discretion, which of course Parliament wants to change. And under the modern knowledge of checks and balances, that's not very much a check if the king decides when they meet and when they don't meet and all that good stuff. So long story short, what eventually happens is we have more concern for conflict. There's more need for funds. Charles does all sorts of shady things like expanding pre-existing taxes, but he can't create any new taxes. And so finally he decides he's had enough, and he is going to arrest the leaders of Parliament and jail them. Of course, there are people in Parliament who know this is the case, and they aren't there when he rides in on his horse into Parliament to try to arrest them. And so we start the English Civil War in 1642, right at the end of our time period. Very briefly, the sides are those that support the king. They are called Cavaliers, like the Cleveland NBA basketball team or the University of Virginia. I don't know if y'all got a chance in English to get to the Cavalier poets, but several of those do exist. Robert Herrick, all that good stuff. And then we have the Roundheads, because many of the members of Parliament are Puritans who are known for their stylish bowl haircuts. Their leader is a guy named Oliver Cromwell, who will certainly become the leader of England in the next unit. We'll talk about him then. And so this war rages the last couple of years of our time period, and it does not end until early in the next. So we'll save the results of that until next week. I think you probably already know what happened, but just in case, we'll save those results. Bit of a cliffhanger for your weekend, something to be excited about. Okay? And some of you are smiling because right now life is that boring for some of us that is exciting. So, yay! Hey, it's the little things, right, guys? So anyway, the point is that we have this calamitous conflict that's taking place in England over the rights of Parliament versus the rights of kings. As you and I both know, this will not be the last time we have said conflict. Wink, wink. All right? So that's England. Really nothing else to talk about in France at this point. Louis XIII is pretty forgettable. So we'll technically Louis XIV becomes king in 1643, but he's 5. So we'll wait till the next time period to talk about him. The HRE, let's go there. This is where we'll end. The HRE is going to have what's called the 30 Years' War. This again is the last major religious conflict. Because at this point, we're going to kill so many people, we start to have this notion that perhaps we should just let people worship as they want and leave it alone. So the 30 Years' War starts off as a localized conflict. The city of Prague is the seat of a territory called Bohemia. Bohemia is very Protestant. Their king dies unexpectedly without an heir, without a successor. So as was the custom at the time, the HRE emperor could appoint a temporary executive until we decide, the nobles of Bohemia decide who shall be their next monarch. Being that they're very Protestant, the good thing to have done would have been for the HRE emperor, who's a Habsburg of Austria, so he is, of course, Catholic, would have been for him to appoint a Protestant. Keep the peace, just make it work. He, however, decides to be, as the British would say, cheeky, and he appoints a Catholic. Knowing this will probably make them angry, but it's good for him. What he doesn't anticipate is riot, rebellion, and threat of violence. So he realizes pretty quickly that he overplayed his hand. Uh-oh, I went too far. So he sends 2 ambassadors to Prague to make nice. Notice he doesn't go. Makes sense. Miranda, question? Or are you just flexing your hand muscles there? Okay, I didn't know if you're doing some, if you've been on a flight where they do those, here's how you exercise your hands over there. Yeah, anyway. Yeah, they used to, it's good time, like playing exercise videos, good times. So the point is that these 2 dudes go. They are not warmly received. In fact, after giving very little time for them to make their case, they are thrown out a window about 70 feet above the ground in Prague Castle. And they land in a giant pile of manure. Now, whether this was intentional, happenstance, I tend to think it was intentional, because what a great metaphor to send those stinky turds from the HRE emperor's office back to Vienna smelling like, well, stinky turds. So that either way, this is not well received, because if you treat the ambassador of the king poorly, that's like you treating the king poorly. They represent him. So this will not stand. The Habsburg army is coming for the Prague folk, Bohemians. It should have stayed there. For a lot of reasons we're not getting into at this point because it doesn't matter, this conflict quickly blows up and becomes an HRE-wide issue. Probably should have stayed there, but there's a lot of tension in Europe over religion. Even now, 130 years after Martin Luther, at this point 100 years after Martin Luther has nailed some documents to a church door, and we end up with a Donnybrook for pretty much everybody involved. The British don't get involved because they're on their island doing their thing. The Russians don't care. They stay out of it. A lot of other people get involved. The Spanish, the French, the Danes, the Swedes, the Italians send some people. The Pope certainly has a sight in this conflict, and it turns into a 30-year knockdown, drag-out, bloody war. What are the results? Well, number one, the HRE is pretty much done. 1/3 of their civilians die. All of the conflict happens within their borders. You never want to be the home team in a war. You're going to suffer more than anybody else. So they will limp on for another 156 years after this happens, but they will never again be the power they were. Never. So we're going to change the power dynamics of Europe. And in fact, some of our HRE states, we had 300 plus, start to consolidate, and eventually in the 19th century, we'll get Germany. The other impact is we're going to see official Dutch independence at the end of this. The Netherlands becomes independent in 1648. And then probably the most impactful thing long-term is we sign the Treaty of Westphalia, which extends the rights of HRE leaders to make the religious choice for their population. In 1555, the Peace of Augsburg, it had been the Lutherans and the Catholics. We extend that right to the Calvinists as well. So it's not earth-shattering. This is not all of us can worship as we want to and freedom of conscience. No, you're smarter than that. You know we're not doing any of those things yet. But it is another tiny baby step. Peace of Augsburg, Edict of Nantes, Treaty of Westphalia, baby steps toward that eventual Enlightenment bedrock of freedom of religion and or from religion, which is part of the modern world. Excuse me, we're starting to take those early steps toward that here in the 17th century. Okay? And that's why 1648 is chosen as the end of this era, because it's basically the last big religious war. Doesn't mean we automatically have sense. We also see at this time still some witch trials, which will extend into the next unit. They don't really die out until we get to the later 1600s, but a lot of the early witch hysteria happens in the late part of time period 1. Can anybody tell me who was often targeted as being suspected of being witches?
Just like women in general.
Women, what kind of
or
witches?
like widows.
Widows?
Widows.
Often women who have what?
An education. Is that-
Somewhat, sure, could be.
They still have their like cut or like the money from like.
Correct. Many
and
of these
property.
women, absolutely perfect. Good job, Rachel and Elizabeth, putting together. Thank you. They were widowed. If they got remarried, their property or wealth would have gone to their new husband. So many of them just chose not to get remarried. And it's just seen as really odd that a woman would be on her own and be financially successful. And you know what? And not like have her farm or her business or whatever blow up and just fall into the earth. She actually was capable of doing some of this. Well, the only answer, ladies, is she must be in league with Satan. There's no other possible answer. That's the only possible way that could be true. So clearly she's a witch. And this will continue into the next unit. We do finally start to see an end to the witchcraft craze with the values of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment becoming more pronounced. But some of these ideas linger on even into the 1700s. So it's an old thing that dies slowly. Speaking of that, the scientific revolution, we see some of that happen in this time period. I'll mention a few of those things, but a lot of the more significant accomplishments do happen in the next time period, but we'll at least start the scientific revolution, and then that's the last thing I have. And so we'll finish that in a couple minutes. We know that the scientific revolution is, if you want to define it, would be a revolution in science. Yeah. And so basically what we're going to do is apply some standards to what we know. Can it be proven through experimentation? Can it be repeated by someone else under similar conditions in a different place? If not, it's not science. So we start to collate and create what makes something scientific. Some of us still to this day, when we hear the word scientific theory, we're like, oh, it's a guess. That's not what that means in science. You all know that. It just means we can't prove it 1,000%, but we're like 994% most of the time sure it's true. But for some people, they hear theory and go, oh, they're just guessing. Guess what these people's scientific backgrounds are? Not much. So anyway, the point of this is that we're going to challenge tradition. We're going to want to prove things. And this has long-standing ramifications, much bigger than even science. What is your evidence? That's something we're often asked. Right now, we're trying to figure out potential ways to diminish the effects of coronavirus and eventually have a vaccine. I read an article a friend posted this morning about one drug I'd heard about several weeks ago that's having some really good efficacy in limited trial. Of course, we got to expand that. We got to do more testing. But good news is good news. I'll take it. It's called Remdesivir. I can't pronounce it very well, but if you're bored today and are interested in that stuff, feel free to look it up. But they've had some success in Chicago emergency rooms, making people get better with the symptoms much faster. So who knows if that'll work or not, but science is going to help us find that out. So all that stuff starts about 350 years ago, which is part of this process. So the grandfather of the scientific revolution is a guy named Nicholas Copernicus, Polish astronomer. Does anyone remember what his theory is? What is he known for believing?
He's like
The
the first.
Yep. Caroline, say it.
Sorry. Heliocentric system.
And Caroline, what does that mean before you put your mute back on?
That we revolve around the sun and not around the earth.
Correct. And there was a lot of opposition to this, mainly from the Catholic Church, because the Bible clearly says the earth stood still. Yet all of us can look up and see that things are moving in the sky. The sun's in one position, later it's in another, stars, moon, etc. So clearly, if we take the Bible literally, which at this point we are, that means that the earth stood still. Everything else is moving around us. Now, we would argue, why does the church care? Well, because of the Reformation. We already feel added and attacked, so we're going to be a little more virulent in our desire to defend our point of view. And so Copernicus realizes this could get him in trouble. He tells his attorney not to put out his book until he is dead. So literally Copernicus is not around to deal with potential punishment. The church is extreme in its response. No, and no one can touch this. You cannot do research. You cannot write about it. You cannot publish it. Now, of course, there are some scientists who are going to be doing that unofficially, but they cannot share their work. People like Kepler, Tycho Brahe, et cetera, are going to be doing work on this in the late 1500s, early 1600s, but they can't go public with it. We only know about their work later. But the key figure in all of this, which we'll end with today, is, of course, Galileo. Galileo, an Italian, strong Catholic. His daughter is a nun. He was boyhood friends with the Pope. He'd always been a supporter of the church, but he starts to do research and has mathematical models to support Copernicus. It's not just a theory based on observation. Now we can add some math in because he has the advantage of using a new invention called the telescope to support some of the theories we had earlier. He goes to the church numerous times, says, hey, this is what I'm thinking. What do y'all think? Can I publish this? Is this cool? And they say, as you all remember probably from our trial, especially if you were involved in it, as long as you say it as a theory and not as a fact, sure. Of course, Galileo, being a little bit subversive, has this come out in a book where it's a dialogue, a conversation. His character says all the right things and does all the things that are intelligent. And of course, the position of the church is under a character called Simplicio, which is a nice way of saying idiot. The Pope gets mad. He also dedicates the book to the Pope. Whoops. And so the church is going to try Galileo. And in 1633, he is found guilty of heresy, of publishing this idea, and is sentenced to house arrest. The only reason he was probably not executed was because the Pope still had a soft spot for his old friend. And so the last 9 years of his life, he is under house arrest. The church does not apologize to him for this until 1992, 350 years later. So that's where we are. A lot of the other accomplishments of the scientific revolution will happen after 1648. People like Newton, some of the other scientists, Paracelsus, etc. But we'll talk more about them later. But for right now, that's good enough on the scientific revolution. So that's where we are in 1648. Religious wars, at least in large part, are now done. Some of the traditional beliefs that supported these ideas are still going to hang on, but we're starting to see it transition to more of a scientific basis for our thoughts. It's going to take a while to catch on, but it's the beginning of that process that will eventually lead to things like the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's what I have. Does anybody have any questions?